Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, our mission, it's pretty specific. We're looking at where politics and prophecy seem to collide. We're dissecting the immediate aftermath of that New York City mayoral election, the one held November 4th, 2025.
Right, and the outcome there was Zoran Mamdani, a Democratic Socialist, 34-year-old state assemblyman. He won.
Okay.
Now, what makes this relevant for our discussion today isn't just his progressive platform, but really his established record of, well, pretty vocal criticism of Israel.
Right, but we're deliberately setting aside the usual political takes here.
Exactly.
We want to analyze this really quite extraordinary spiritual interpretation that's been layered onto this specific event.
And that brings us to the source material, particularly the urgent warning from Rabbi Curt Landry.
Yeah, his take is striking. He sees this election result not as, typical politics,
Right.
but as a profound spiritual rupture. He even calls it a major gate for the United States of America.
Specifically flagging New York as our main financial gate.
Yeah.
That's crucial to his interpretation.
So the claim is this vote is somehow a divine tipping point.
Yeah. And our mission today is really to understand the why behind that. How does a local election in New York City suddenly take on these massive prophetic and even financial consequences for the whole country, according to this view?
Okay, let's start unpacking that. It really begins with how the source material designates New York City. Why NYC? Why is it the gate city?
Well, it's seen as having this dual prophetic role. First, like we mentioned, it's viewed as the gateway of finances, not just for the U.S., but, by extension, for the nations.
Okay, the financial hub. Makes sense.
And second, it has the world's second highest population of Jewish people outside of Israel itself.
Right.
So according to the source, the moment the city voted for policies, and maybe more specifically, for people seen as, quote, cursing Israel rather than blessing it, well, that's when they opened themselves up to judgment.
So that's the core link then. Political alignment, particularly on Israel, clicks into spiritual consequence.
That's the argument.
Which leads us straight to that pretty stark warning from the book of Ezekiel.
It does, yeah. Rabbi Landry argues that this vote is essentially the people profaning the name of God.
Profaning his name.
By choosing leaders and policies that align with what he calls the same spirit that we've been battling in Israel and Gaza. He directly references Ezekiel 39, verses 7 and 8.
Okay.
Where God basically says, look, I'm not going to let them profane my holy name anymore. And when I act, the nations will know that I am the Lord, the Holy One of Israel.
That sounds severe. How does the source connect that kind of, global level divine statement to a local city election? Is it just the financial gate aspect?
The financial gate is definitely key in this interpretation. It's seen as the place where God's covenant principles directly intersect with the world systems. But it's also that the source sees this choice, this political choice, as mirroring that spiritual battle. By choosing leadership viewed as anti-Israel, the argument goes, New York activated this heavenly justice mechanism tied to that promise of blessing those who bless Israel and cursing those who curse it.
So the source is saying God won't tolerate this profanation and the consequences will ripple out, hitting America right through its main financial gateway. It sounds like they see it as almost unavoidable cause and effect.
It is framed precisely that way, unavoidable. And this leads to a pretty sharp critique of the voters themselves.
How so?
The sources claim the vote wasn't just a political calculation, but driven by a deception and delusional spirit.
A delusional spirit? What's the evidence for that, according to them?
Well, what stood out to Landry, according to the source, was the mechanism of the supposed deception.
Which was?
It centers on Mamdani's platform, which included promises of, free things, universal health care, universal housing funded by taxing the productive sectors.
Okay, standard progressive policies.
Right, but Landry views this as the classic downfall of socialism. The source says people voted for temporary comfort, these free things, over being right with God. They argue voters bought into a delusional narrative because, there's nothing free and no sustainable long play in that kind of economics from his perspective.
That's a pretty strong accusation to make against millions of voters. What else supports this idea of delusion, according to the source? Is it just the policies?
It's not just what happened, but crucially when it happened. The timing is seen as deeply significant.
Okay, the timing. The election was November 4th, 2025. How does that fit?
On the Hebrew calendar, that corresponded to Cheshvan 13, February 786.
Cheshvan 13. Okay, and that puts it right before.
Exactly. Just days before Cheshvan 17. And Cheshvan 17, according to Genesis 7:1-1, is the very day the great flood began in Noah's time.
Wow. Okay, so that connection is seen as anything but coincidental.
Definitely not. It immediately brings in the flood analogy.
Let's talk about that analogy. The flood was God's judgment on a whole world system built in rebellion against him. So the source sees the NYC vote as a modern parallel, like a societal deluge of delusion where policies actively rejected God's design.
That's the core argument, precisely. Society, or at least this key part of it, publicly embraced policies they link to spiritual rebellion, choosing, perceived earthly comfort over covenant principles, much like the generation of Noah, according to this interpretation.
And the year itself, 5786, that also plays a role.
It does. The number 6 in Scripture is often associated with man, imperfection, and falling short.
Okay.
So the year 5786 is interpreted as signaling divine dealings, a time of correction focused on man's rebellion and choices.
So because this rejection of covenant principles happened through the financial gate, the expectation, according to the source, is potential economic shaking, specifically in NYC, and maybe also a rise in antisemitism.
Yes, both. Economic instability hitting that financial nerve center and a surge of antisemitism.
You mentioned antisemitism. The source links this to something called the Amalekite spirit. Can you unpack that term for listeners who might not be familiar? What does it represent in this context?
Sure. In the biblical narrative the source is drawing from, Amalek represents this ancient, persistent enemy of Israel.
Okay.
An enemy that attacks not just the Jewish people directly, but also, significantly, those nations or individuals who stand with them.
So in this interpretation,
it's seen as the spiritual force behind opposition to U.S.-Israel alliances. The source argues this spirit is manifesting politically, and the NYC election outcome is presented as evidence of it raging against America's support for Israel.
Okay, so the warning is very clear. We have the problem, the profanation, the delusion, the timing, the potential consequences like the flood. But the source doesn't just leave it there, does it? It pivots to the response.
Right. It shifts focus from the judgment, the flood, to the required response, which they call the ark.
The ark, representing preservation, safety.
Exactly. And there's a specific mandate given for believers for what the sources call the Ecclesia, the church.
And this mandate is for this Cheshvan moment.
Yes. It's presented as a 5-step strategy, drawing directly from the prophet Habakkuk chapter 2. And the emphasis is really on activation, not fear or retreat.
Yeah. Okay, this sounds like the actionable part. We should probably slow down and detail these 5 steps from Habakkuk 2. What's step 1?
Step 1 is stand and watch.
Stand and watch. What does that mean practically?
It means taking a firm, unwavering stand for righteousness. You can't just bury your head in the sand, pretend the political climate has no spiritual weight. It's about being observant, spiritually awake, and morally anchored.
Okay, stand your ground and pay attention. What's step 2?
Step 2, set myself on a rampart.
On a rampart, like a castle wall?
Sort of, yeah. Think of it as positioning yourself on a spiritual high place, a place of perspective. The source says it's about getting above the delusional narrative that's swirling around.
How do you do that?
It's about checking your own alignment. Asking yourself, am I blessing God? Right? Am I blessing Israel? Am I living according to covenant principles? Getting that higher perspective.
Right. Step 3 then is watch and see what he says. This seems more passive, more about listening.
It is about listening, intentionally standing still and tuning in to hear what God is saying in the midst of the noise. It's not about frantic action.
Okay.
Because the source argues that correction is coming. But and this is important, it's not necessarily framed as punishment for sin.
Not punishment. Then what?
More like divine repositioning, God trying to move you, guide you out of the direct path of what the source calls a Category 5 storm of wrath. It's actually presented as an act of protection.
Okay, that reframes correction quite a bit, which leads perfectly into step 4. Embrace correction. You just said it's protective, which sounds counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Why is the source so insistent that judgment or correction is actually a friend to those who want to be right with God?
Well, the argument presented is that judgment is actually necessary. The source quotes, "It's judgment out of the courts of heaven that brings justice on earth." So if a system or a city or even a personal life is built on something corrupt or delusional, then correction is the only way to restore true alignment and ultimately true prosperity.
So the storms of consequences, the potential economic hits, the pressures, they're seen as tools for realignment.
Exactly. Tools designed not purely for destruction, but to correct the course, to shake things up so that the righteous can ultimately prosper. They even cite Jeremiah 29 alert, the promise of hope and a future, even during a time of captivity or correction.
Okay, that connects consequence directly to destiny, viewing disruption as divine redirection. Powerful idea. What's the fifth and final step?
Write the vision.
Write it down.
Yes. Take action to document what you sense the Spirit is saying. Make it clear, plain on tablets, as Habakkuk says, that we may run who read it.
Why is writing it down so important?
Because, as the verse continues, the just shall live by faith. Documenting the vision anchors your faith and gives clear direction for action. And the whole response needs to be rooted in prayer, specifically crying out, Father God, in wrath, remember mercy.
This whole framework, these steps, it sounds like this Cheshvan moment is forcing a kind of sorting process, a division.
That's exactly how the source material portrays it. It leads into the final section, preparing for what they call the Hanukkah Miracle.
Okay, how does the NYC election outcome relate to this division?
It's viewed as a spiritual litmus test, creating a necessary, even profound division within the American church itself. It's forcing a separation, they argue, between sheep cities and goat cities, symbolizing alignment versus misalignment with God's purposes. The time for compromise, they say, is over.
And the source really doubles down on that claim we touched on earlier, that the NYC result is direct payback for the U.S. standing with Israel.
Yes, that narrative is presented very strongly. They specifically mention things like recent pro-Israel actions. President Trump's hostage negotiations are cited as an example.
So the Amalekite spirit is seeking revenge.
By hitting the U.S. in its most crucial financial artery, its main gate. That's the interpretation.
So given that threat, what's the ultimate goal for believers in this scenario?
It's multifaceted. First, they need to be the ark, that vessel of preservation, remaining steadfast during the storm.
Okay, be the safe place.
Right. And second, they need to act as Maccabean warriors.
Maccabean warriors, what does that signify here? Like the Hanukkah story.
Exactly. The Maccabees famously fought against overwhelming spiritual and cultural oppression. So the source encourages believers today to actively fight the modern delusion, not with weapons, but with the praise hammer, with truth, with active engagement rather than passive acceptance.
And the timing of all this points towards?
Directly towards Hanukkah, it's just weeks away from this election moment. The source explicitly calls for a Hanukkah miracle.
A miracle for what?
To, quote, light the menorah of common sense and the righteousness in the ways of God. It's a call for the church to rise up in truth and holiness, declaring this isn't a time for fear, but for faith to actively usher in the kingdom through demonstrating God's power and ways.
Okay, so let's bring this all together for you, the listener. What's the core takeaway here? This deep dive suggests that, according to this specific interpretation, the NYC election is seen as a symptom.
A symptom of a larger national spiritual issue, maybe a lack of understanding or even fear of God's ways.
And the response demanded is pretty radical. Realignment. Not fear, not retreat, but active, strategic faith and obedience, using those Habakkuk steps we outlined.
Right. And if you look back over everything we've discussed from the source material, perhaps the most surprising or challenging claim is that this whole period of correction is framed as fundamentally hopeful.
Hopeful, even with warnings of judgment and storms.
Yes. Because the argument is that God is acting because he refuses to let his name be profaned. So the immediate consequence, that judgment potentially hitting the financial gate, is presented as the very evidence of his protective intervention.
Meaning, the storm itself is proof that God is actively involved in restoring justice.
That's the idea. So the final thought for you to really mull over is this. If this source perspective is correct, that judgment actually brings justice.
Mm-hmm.
How does viewing potential economic or political turmoil, not just as crisis, but as divine protection and redirection, change how you might perceive, well, the next few years?
It definitely shifts the perspective, turning what looks like political failure into a moment brimming with spiritual opportunity.
Exactly. A challenging thought to end on.